All right, thank you. So first, let me thank Michael for organizing the conference and the rest of the, and all of the workshop organizers, of course. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to be around here more. I've heard it's been a very good time, but I'm enjoying myself today. So what I'm going to tell you about today is some work my group's been doing over the last few years, where our goal has really been to try to use some recent developments in the fundamental theory of non-equilibrium systems and bring those ideas to bear on a very practical problem of materials design. And in particular, what I want to tell you about is some efforts to design what I'll call functional materials. By functional, I mean that we're not just interested in having a design for a system that assembles into a target structure, but rather we want that structure to do something dynamically. So this might be, for concreteness, a design which generates a cluster, assembles a cluster spontaneously, but then also interconverts that cluster into another one, for example, with some time lag, some delay. To do so robustly necessarily means to consume energy, hence why ideas from non-equilibrium statistical mechanics will be very relevant. So my talk is broken up into three little vignettes, the first of which is to introduce you into some of those new non-equilibrium ideas that are particularly relevant for this talk. Then I'll tell you about how we've turned those into a variational algorithm to find design principles for specific systems, and then I'll conclude with some examples of the systems we've developed in silico, so computationally. All right, so to start, these are basically the two results that I'm going to leverage through this talk. They're essentially basic ideas that are from a field called stochastic thermodynamics, a theory of dynamical processes and complex systems. And they are in two forms. One is a basic theory associated with how rate processes are changed when you couple a system to a dissipative environment, and specifically how you can enhance the rate of some rare event. And the other is what I call the Kawasaki-Crookes relationship, which essentially tells us how probability distributions are reshaped upon taking them out of equilibrium. So let me dive in briefly to both of those two. So in the first, what we've derived fairly recently in a paper a few years ago with my student Ben Kuznets-Speck was a pretty general bound on the rate at which a system transforms between two metastable states. So let's walk through an example of that. So this is kind of canonical chemical physics. So imagine I have some potential that has two metastable states. I'll label those A and B with a barrier between them. We know microscopically how you compute the rate of a barrier crossing event, the characteristic time scale it takes for a system initially localized on one of those sides of the potential to overcome a barrier and get to the other side. Microscopically or statistically, a rate is nothing but the time rate of change of a conditional probability, the likelihood that I get into B at some time t, given I start on the A side. So that's probabilistically what we mean by a rate. And by unwrapping that conditional probability, thinking about ensembles of trajectories that I won't go into, we can show quite generally that the rate of some event in equilibrium, so in the connected to thermal fluctuations, not being driven by any active noise or any non-gradient forces, that rate relative to a non-equilibrium rate, something that is coupled to a dissipative process, the rate enhancement achievable is bounded from above by how much heat is dissipated over the course of the transition. So that sounds like a very intuitive result, I think. Essentially, it tells you that there's no free lunch. If I want to speed up some process, I need to expend some energy. But as it tells you exactly sharply what that trade-off is. The most I can hope to enhance the rate of some event is given by the heat that's released to the environment in units of kBt, turns out to be divided by 2. This heat, to be very concrete, is the excess heat. It's that heat dissipated to the environment due to some non-equilibrium force. Now, we've realized this in this original paper in really toy models, and very recently in some more complex systems. So just to give you an example of how this works, this is a fluid of a so-called active Brownian particles. These are particles that have little vectors that point you into a direction where they like to be advected. So this requires energy to do that advection. That vector rotates through a rotational diffusion, but because of that motility, it's a non-equilibrium system. If I denote that motility with a V, when V is 0, this is a passive colloidal fluid here in 2 dimensions. If that V is finite, it's an active fluid. And I can ask if I submerge or solvate a passive dimer, this little red dimer here, a pair of colloids that can exist in either a compact or an extended state, what is the rate of going from compact to extended as a function of the self-propulsion of that active fluid it's solvated in? Just to give you concretely what that looks like, this is a passive case. It takes a long time to see some compact to extended transition. When I increase that self-propulsion velocity, those particles pull that dimer apart pretty rapidly. In fact, the rate of going from compact to extended is increased by about an order of magnitude or so as I span this kind of range of self-propulsion velocities. But relevant for this talk, that rate enhancement is indeed bounded by how much heat is dissipated due to the active driving in the vicinity of that passive pair. So we know that this bound is saturated in 2 limits. In an equilibrium limit, it's saturated trivially, and therefore anything linear response related to equilibrium, it's also saturated. But it turns out to be saturated in a limit where the non-equilibrium driving force is completely funneled into the reactive mode, something I think is also very intuitive. If I add energy in some way in just the right direction that I want to react in, I will most favorably or most efficiently transfer that energy into a reaction. Okay, so keep this in mind when I start talking about specific examples. This is a principle that we'll use to kind of understand the results that we see. The next basic result I want to tell you about is something called the Kawasaki-Crookes relationship. It's essentially a statement of how probability distributions change as I take them away from equilibrium. Okay, so we all know, I presume everyone in this room has had a statistical mechanics class. You know that if I take a potential, say this as a function of some coordinate r, that Boltzmann would tell us that the probability distribution of a passive particle moving in this potential is concentrated where the potential is lowest, and how concentrated that potential is depends on things like the temperature. Increased temperature smooths out, right? What is very difficult to intuit, in which we don't have usually general answers for, is what happens if I take that potential and I drive it. The simplest thing I could imagine doing is just adding a constant force that causes a particle to go around a ring. Imagine this is periodically connected. One can typically, for a low-dimensional system like this, brute force that probability distribution. It would look something like that if the force is large. Notice that peak is no longer coincident with the minimum of the potential. This is obvious. I push in this way, I concentrate probability over here. What is hard to do generally is to say, well, what dictates where that probability goes, right? It's not a Boltzmann distribution anymore. Usually to arrive at an answer requires solving a very high dimensional PD, something that's not tractable practically. Absolutely, yes. These are overdamped Langevin equations, stochastic differential equations, so I am guaranteed to have a steady state. Yeah, good question. Right, so I'm interested just in the steady state, like it says right there, if you read. I know you don't. So it turns out I can vary generally, or actually Gavin, hidden in one of his papers from some time ago, wrote out something essentially like this expression. This is kind of a trivial generalization of a result that's in that paper, which says if I look at the non-equilibrium probability distribution on some collective coordinate relative to its equilibrium counterpart, again, this is independent of the specifics of how I drive the system out of equilibrium, that this is equal to the log average of an exponential of the heat that is dissipated as the system relaxes from some conditioned point to its steady state. So I prepare the system at R, I let it relax, and I measure the heat, and that actually tells me what the non-equilibrium distribution will be in steady state. This is not an easy thing to compute often, but it tells you that probability will generically concentrate where the heat is the smallest, where the dissipation towards steady state is the smallest. Yep. Oh, that should be a parentheses, beta on both. Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so probability concentrates where the heat dissipated is the smallest. And so that gives us some idea of how, if I drive a system arbitrarily far from equilibrium, where I might expect to see probability, or therefore particles or conformations, concentrating. Okay, so those are two basic general results. We've realized this kind of recently in an active polymer. So this is a worm-like chain that has little non-gradient forces that act on it stochastically along the tangent vectors of the chain. If I have a passive polymer, so I take those away momentarily, a worm-like chain undulates like you might imagine. Its probability concentrates. If this is a 40mer, pretty close to N, the persistence length is a little bit smaller than the size of the polymer in this case. But if I drive it, it starts to swim. And more often than not, its head is closer to its tail. And so these are log likelihoods, either evaluated empirically from a lot of patients from my postdoc, or with this Kawasaki-Crookes relationship, and those agree exactly, just convincing ourselves that we know how to do math. Right? Okay, so this is the other basic results. We have a sense for how probability distributions deform under non-equilibrium driving. This is a very simple reason. So the advection along the backbone of the polymer is not acted on the head. So if I'm pushing and the head is not also being pushed, I tend to buckle. Right? Okay, so those are nice. Those are the sorts of results that come out of this field of stochastic thermodynamics. A very reasonable question is, why should you care, or what are they good for? Right? So to realize those sorts of relationships in something we care about, we need to figure out how to inverse design non-equilibrium systems. So what I'm going to tell you about now in this little second vignette is how we've developed an algorithm we call variational path sampling to find a set of interactions and driving forces that realize some specific dynamical function. And then in the last few slides of my talk, I'll show you realizations of those in specific systems. Okay, so how does our algorithm for inverse design work for a non-equilibrium system? It's based on a fairly simple idea. So if I tell you a system, I specify its interactions, and I specify its equation of motion. So take concretely as an example, a collection of colloids that are initially dispersed, interact with some pairwise potential. I can typically write down the probability of that initial dispersed collection of colloids evolving in time to some, say, target cluster like I've drawn there. That's a probability I can write down. And if I can write it down for some given force, some intermolecular potential, generally I could write it down for an arbitrary potential, which means that if I change the probability of that trajectory by changing some parameters in the interaction potential, or the effective forces that the particles are feeling, I can then ask the question, well, did that probability to get to this target structure starting in that dispersed state, did it increase or did it decrease? Right? Simple question to ask. A computer can compute those and we can ask it. And then we just follow the gradient. Right? That's a very simple way to design things. We twiddle those parameters and ask, did the probability increase? And if so, then we change the parameters in that direction and iterate. Yeah. Could be. We are, to make this tractable, typically we need to fix the observation time. That's like fixing the ensemble of the trajectories we're interested in. And so if we had an arbitrary time-dependent potential, we'd probably need to be a little bit mindful about whether or not periods can fit into the observation time we're looking at.
Do you allow yourself changing the noise independently on that?
Oh, that's a very good question. No, we do not change the noise. So the thermal statistics of the solvent, we're imagining we don't touch. That actually is an important technical point, because the relative ratio of path probabilities is singular if you change the noise. So for a technical reason, we try to stay away from that. Okay, so that's the algorithm. It turns out to be a little bit more tractable to recast it, not in terms of probabilities, but generating functions. This is a bit technical, but writing down the generating function for some target observable that has a very nice variational bound. It's very similar to what you see in thermodynamics or StatMech known as the Feynman-Bogoliubov bound. Essentially defines a variational space that we try to twiddle those parameters in to affect that transformation. That's a lot. Let's revisit it. Essentially, we can write down a cost function, which really is just like a path partition function. We confirmed a second ago, you've all had a statistical mechanics class, so you know what partition functions are. This is just a partition function in a path space, counts up the number of trajectories that do something I care about. So in this case, maybe afford some assembly to a target structure. In the generating function sense, it's natural to introduce a Lagrange multiplier that tells us if this observable is faithfully reproduced. That could be the probability of a target structure, could be a current that we're interested in optimizing. And that is balanced by essentially the likelihood of pulling out one of those trajectories from an arbitrary trajectory ensemble. It turns out that this is a very nice formal way to set up the problem because there exists an exact answer. This is known in the optimal control, stochastic control theory literature as a Doob problem, or specific a Doob H transform problem. It says that if you could solve a generalized eigenvalue equation of this form, you know exactly how to change your interaction potential to affect that target with probability 1. In general, solving this eigenvalue problem, however, is not tractable. Its space is the whole dimensional space of the system. But the existence of that optimal bound helps us conceptualize how we might try to variationally make our ansatz better. In practice, what we do is stochastic gradient descent. This really was initially done with my student Avishek Das, where we just twiddle the parameters, compute the correlation function that is essentially an exact representation of the gradient, and then update the parameters effectively. Okay, so that's the algorithm. What are we going to do with it? We're going to study a system that will be very familiar to many of you in the audience, DNA-coded colloids. This is a system that if I have many colloids and I allow the interaction matrix between them all to be whatever I want, that very quickly generates a very large design parameter space that might be hard to just brute force study. So specifically what I'm going to imagine doing is having a collection of particles. Each interaction I can tune specifically with some DNA. I'm going to tune the depth of that potential, and I'll show a lot of matrices that look like this, where color intensities will tell you the depth of that potential for specific interactions. The initial target things we'll try to study are the formation of little clusters or their dynamics, as well as I'll get to a microphase separated system. And all of this will be in the presence of a shear flow. So that will be the non-equilibrium driving force, something that is very blunt, that we expect to not be able to do anything very specific. And yet we'll figure out in running this algorithm how we can leverage a very blunt non-equilibrium force to affect something very specific, like the interconversion of these two clusters. All right, game clear? All right, let's see if we can do some interesting things. So the first thing was just a sanity check. Can we just design interaction potentials or strengths of shear flows that will just target a assembly? So this is designing for kind of what I've already alluded to, starting in a dispersed state and assembling into some specific predetermined cluster. Some of these clusters are compact. Some of these are what we call non-rigid. These are 2D compact structures, but exist in 3 dimensions. If I just throw those colloids in a box, I would preferentially form this polytetrahedra cluster. I'd have some probability of forming an octahedra. These non-compact structures are basically never found. So this is just having uniform interactions. That's kind of the null space that we'll start with. If I now run the algorithm and allow specific interactions to be generated, we can increase the yield of either of those two colloidal clusters to basically 100%. These are the interaction matrices that result from that algorithm. These essentially reproduce known results from Michael Brenner and his group over the course of the last 10 years that have studied these things. They basically label each interaction that I want to engineer. So it's not a surprising result, but something that we were able to recover without putting that in by hand. Now notice these non-compact structures are not even in this optimal sense very high, 10%, 5%, that's not great. If we then allow the algorithm to vary the shear rate that the system is experiencing, these compact structures are actually maximize their yield at zero shear. That's not surprising. There's something that already maximizes a potential energy. Any shear is just going to try to pull them apart. But these non-rigid structures actually have a maximum shear rate in which they are most highly yielded in. This is also, if you think about it, not that surprising. We have essentially a linear shear profile that's an elongational flow. Things that are 2D rigid will align in that flow and then be very stable because of it. A simple way to picture that is, put a stick in a river, the stick will orient in the direction of the river. These non-compact structures are doing the same. Right? Okay, so those are just yields of specific colloidal clusters. Let's do something more interesting.
Sorry, is crucial the geometry or the fact that they have zero mode? I thought the zero mode allows you this extra thing because it's sustainable, it's susceptible to this shear, right?
Well, all of these have a zero rotational mode. They can all tumble.
So the number of actual components are the same, all of them.
So
rigid, right?
no, so these two are 2D rigid. These are rigid in 3 space, these are rigid in 2 space. So I guess in that sense there's a zero mode. Okay, that's true. Okay. That's true. Yeah. Okay, very good. Okay, so this is, I would say, still equilibrium assembly of a sort. I've perturbed it by adding a shear, but I've only asked about the yields of structures. Now let's play something a little bit more fun that really you can only do if you have your hand on a whole trajectory. And that's to ask a question of, how do I optimally interconvert in steady state between 2 of these clusters? So again, this is, if I want to cycle between, say, this polytetrahedral cluster and the octahedral cluster, if I really want to cycle there, that is something strictly forbidden in an equilibrium system. An equilibrium system is an absence of currents. There is no cycles in an equilibrium system. It's like the old ratchet and paw from Feynman. I can't spin the ratchet by just having a thermal bath. I have to inject energy to get that directionality. So I'm going to define the current of interest, the thing that I'm going to try to maximize, as the likelihood of starting in A, going to B, after some lag time tau, less the opposite. So that really is a directional current. It's a reactive current. Okay, run it through the algorithm. Nothing really changes in practice about how we do that optimization, other than now this is a time non-local observable. And what we find is that in equilibrium, as a function of the shear rate, indeed you have no current, and you can drive a current by applying a finite shear. There's a maximum here essentially because at very large values of the shear, we start tearing apart the clusters. Right? So if you're allowed to make the strength of the interactions within those clusters arbitrarily large, you could move this maxima arbitrarily far. It's interesting to decompose that current into the pieces that make it up. Specifically, that current is the probability of starting in A, and then the reaction rate of going from A to B, less the opposite, the probability of being in B and reacting from B to A. And what you notice is what results, why this maxima, why this behavior results, is essentially because the reactive rates, those are things that can be finite at equilibrium, those are the circles. Both of those increase as I increase the shear. All right, that was basic result number 1. Rates increase as you couple them to a dissipative force. So those rates do, in fact, increase. They essentially plateau at the point where they become so unstable they start falling apart. And at the same time that the rates increase, one of those yields, the yields of cluster B, starts to decrease, while the other one actually increases first. This has to do with the fact that this has more rotational symmetry than this polytetrahedra. It actually will orient better in the shear flow too. What is nice about having an algorithm that lets us just discover these results is that this is an example of something we wouldn't have just anticipated. Naively, in fact, what I did is I told Avishek, well, maybe likely the optimal interaction potential will just be the mean between the two. That's kind of what I would expect. I want to have something that kind of stabilizes this, kind of stabilizes that, take the average. This is the matrix that stabilizes B. That's the matrix that stabilizes A. Indeed, there's a lot of motifs in the resultant matrix that stabilizes the highest current, but it's not exactly the mean. In fact, there are some specific weakened bonds that actually are what get activated in the shear flow. There's a weak bond that gets torn off and lets it isomerize. Okay, oh, is this movie going to play? Just to show you what that little cycle looks like. There's my polytetrahedra, turns into an octahedra, and then goes back.
What about other configurations? Are they part of this story, or you just disregarded it?
Remind me at the end, and I could show you a slide where we've essentially all of those compact 3D clusters we could do the same thing with, but I'll skip that for time.
No, I mean these two.
So in this case, so of course those other compact clusters are part of the ensemble, but they are preferentially disallowed. So the likelihood of visiting them is very low. In fact, if you're really careful, you can catch the kind of intermediate state that gets visited. It's very quick. So it's one of the non-compact structures that it kind of transiently goes through. Okay, all right, so perfect. So that's a single cluster. There's actually some nice theory that one can write down to actually understand this pretty well. The astute observer, or the person very knowledgeable of non-equilibrium stat mech, would say you can't actually cycle between two states. There's no such thing. And that's true. What the interesting bit here being that it's not actually just a two-state system. There's a hidden dimensionality associated with the orientation in that shear flow. That actually provides kind of a four-state system that you can actually drive a cycle within. And this is just a little theory that we wrote down of a dimer that kind of realizes that the rate is then quadratic in that shear rate like we see in this simulation. Okay, but I want to get to something slightly more interesting in the last few minutes. Huh? Ooh, will it swim? That's a loaded question. I don't know. Good question, yeah. Okay, all right, that's just one cluster. Okay, admittedly a little boring. Let's have many, right? Turns out if I want to stabilize many clusters, that doesn't happen with just short-range interactions. The distribution of cluster sizes, if I use my optimal interaction potential that I optimize for one cluster, having many is exponentially unlikely. But we know how to solve that. Gelbart did this a long time ago. Thank you for that. You just need a long-range repulsion, and that will stabilize a cluster of whatever size I want. Essentially, the cluster size that's stabilized is a geometric mean between the long-range repulsion and the short-range attraction. Okay, so this was, again, something we designed by letting parameters in a Yukawa potential float. That just shows that it's stable, sticks around. Okay, now let's ask a more interesting question, dynamic. Let's imagine once I have this microphase separation that I'm interested in doing some chemistry. Say I want to design a system that optimally moves particles around it. So I can, for example, start with a system that is all blue, all red, and every time a particle hops between the cluster, I color it blue. That's something that would happen even in equilibrium, but it would be quite slow. In the presence of a shear force, I might be able to speed up. Indeed, when we run the optimal design, what we find is that to maximally stabilize the microphase, I get the black curve. But if I run then this exchange reaction, the interconversion of clusters is quite small because I've stabilized the clusters. However, I could run the design and ask for what is the optimal potential that enhances the flux of clusters between them, a non-trivial question because I still need to have clusters to go between. So I can't just destabilize the cluster. I get something that slightly makes it unstable, generates a little bit of a barrier, and looks like that, and the fraction of clusters has a rate of about 10 times faster. Just to conclude, this is actually a pretty interesting result, I think, because it leverages the breaking of detail balance that is only afforded in a non-equilibrium system. Namely, in an equilibrium system, detail balance says that my densities, the likelihoods of seeing states, say A or B, exactly determine the ratio of rates to go from A to B. I have no independence to tune stabilities or rate constants. The two are intertwined. But if I have a non-equilibrium system, detail balance is broken, I can actually both optimize the rate to hop between states as well as their stabilities. And this is a demonstration of that. If I optimize stability, so the yield of microphases near equilibrium, I have a maximum here, and if I optimize the flux, that maximum shifts to different interaction potentials. This is essentially a scale of the barrier in that Yukawa potential, and this is the depth of that potential. Far from equilibrium, the maxima can become coincident because I can actually optimize both simultaneously. All right, that's all I have. All of this was done by a really phenomenal PhD student, Avishek Das, who's now, I've lost to Amsterdam, but it's very good for him. I'm sad he's gone because he was excellent. I've done all of this at Berkeley, in places like the Kavli Foundation and the Department of Energy have funded the work. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Petr Schulz from Arizona State. Nice work.
Thank you.
I just want to clarify if I understood correctly. So you have, in these examples you showed, you have 3 strengths. Those are the 3 parameters you optimize over.
So depends on the system. So here, for example, I have a WCA potential I don't change. That's just a repulsion. I have a Morse potential. That's the short range attraction. I have a Yukawa potential, but that actually has 2 parameters, a strength of the repulsion as well as the length over which it decays. We have played with the characteristic scale of the Morse potential also, but in addition to those kind of potential parameters, we also have then the shear flow, and so we optimize that too.
And does this formalism also allow you to optimize over temperature protocol or chemical potentials?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the acknowledgement that it's hard to change the scale of the noise, so if the temperature is just the noise, then that's hard, but if we were changing, say, the time dependence or the protocol dependence of the strength of the potential, that's simple to do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Very, very exciting talk, actually. So, can you connect some dots for me? It's about the beginning, this fundamental results you gave. So, around like late 90s, there were a couple of important results, that the Jarzynski equation and fluctuation theorem. In addition, there is this elusive result of Prigozhin about the minimal, what's called minimal dissipation or whatever, minimal entropy production, right? Principle, which I don't know, much less solid than. Can you connect those, if any connection exists, to the results that you gave us?
Yeah. So both this result and this result are essentially derivable from the fluctuation theorem. So in some sense, the fluctuation theorem encodes this behavior. We just figured out the math to get to them. There's a subtlety in the rate bound in that fluctuation theorem is not sufficient to show that explicitly. You need a little bit more physical argument for why the result ends up to be like it is. This, however, is in Gavin, this Kawasaki-Crookes relationship is in his original fluctuation theorem paper of a sort. We've rewritten it and I think generalized it epsilon away from what he had, but it's really to him. Prigozhin and minimum entropy production or maximum entropy production ideas, I think, are...
They have the same flavor as this one, right?
That's, I mean, it's a little surprising. So I would say that, so I guess there's 2 things. So first, those results are minimum or maximum entropy principles are linear response results. They are valid close to equilibrium. This looks like that, but notice that the average is on the outside of the exponential. So that means that intrinsically in this expectation value are dynamical factors that mean that it's not just given by a simple energetic argument. So in linear response, I can take that average upstairs, and then I do get a minimum dissipation principle. So it is consistent in the linear response. Now, Prigozhin, I don't want to put words in his mouth. He would probably say that it was more general than linear response. So that disclaimer, but I think it's well understood now that it's a near equilibrium statement.
Thank you. Very beautiful talk. This is Xiaoming from University of Michigan. So I'm trying to understand how the calculation works. In the end, you want to optimize some rate between different states, right? But the calculation you do is not directly optimizing the rate, but instead of the heat dissipation using this relation, or how does it work technically?
Yeah, technically we actually are, whatever observable we want to optimize, that's what we actually are optimizing. So in the current stuff, we are really optimizing the current. We interpret the results through these sorts of heat bounds. So we're not actually optimizing, say, the heat that's dissipated from the system. We're optimizing the yield, or we're optimizing the rate. Now we can get a lot of insight into the results that come out of the optimization with results like this, but that's kind of a post-processing step.
I see. So it's not these equations that are directly used.
No. It's what the equations that are actually used are this. So very concretely, this is the functional that we compute for a trajectory. This is whatever time-dependent observable we want. This could be just an indicator function that says we formed a state at the end of our trajectory, or it could be an accumulation of a current. This lambda is just taken large so that we actually do design for this quantity, and then we compute this KL divergence between the trajectory ensembles. So that's a relative entropy, but it's a path entropy, so it's not a simple heat.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. What I should say one more statement. What actually makes this work is the fact that we can actually write down gradients explicitly. So this, I haven't given due justice to this result, which is actually quite nice. This is a generalization of a fluctuation dissipation relationship for a trajectory space. So it tells you how the trajectory probabilities change as I change some parameters. So these are time correlation functions that are integrated that we then compute in the trajectories we're generating to figure out where to update the parameters.
Carl Goodrich, IST Austria. Can you say a little bit about, for the going back and forth between the polytetrahedron and octahedron, what exactly you get from being out of equilibrium? So you talked about how there's this cycle but you have to sort of subtly account for the rotations, and it is a cycle in that sense. If you don't worry about rotations and just sort of want to go back and forth, you can get that without equilibrium.
I can't get a cycle. So what I can't do, so if I just have those two states, I can hop back and forth between those two states, but I can't preferentially progress through the states. So only when I break, so imagine I have some other mechanism of breaking rotational invariance. So I put a surface down, say. I could then go back and forth between polytetrahedron and octahedron. In fact, I can orient, react, reorient, react. That would give me a cycle. But I can't have a net progression through that cycle unless I drive the system out of equilibrium.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. I guess what I'm wondering is you're breaking the rotational symmetry with the shear flow.
But I'm also breaking time reversal symmetry, which then gives me a mechanism for generating cycles.
Right. But if you ignored the rotational aspects of it, if you
then I can't. So if I had a third state that I could transfer through, then I could still have cycles. Otherwise, I can't have a cycle between just two states.
Okay.
I should say, Carl has very nice work on related sorts of things where he optimizes barriers. So in an overdamped near equilibrium limit. Renee's first.
Oh, really? Oh, thanks. Very nice. Very nice. You made this connection with statistical physics several times, and I was wondering how far you could push this in these non-equilibrium systems. I mean, for instance, I was wondering about extensivity of your results. If you scale it up, is it really extensive also with the heat that you need and that needs to be transferred out of the system and then with the boundary conditions? To how far can you push this?
This is a very good question. So I have two things to say. So first, there's a conceptual question about what does the heat mean, especially when I'm asking about how it increases the rate of something local. So the active matter system is an example where I'm actually driving all of the particles. Only a little bit of the system is having a chance to interact with that active bath. So I've slipped something under the rug for the extent of time, in that we've judiciously constructed a reference system that localizes the heat to just the heat that's within the correlation length of the dimer that we're looking at. So otherwise, we could arbitrarily make the bound worse just by scaling up the system. So there are questions about how you decompose the heat. In this case, things are pairwise additive through the pairwise interactions. We can do that neatly. In systems where you can't do that neatly, I think that's an open question. That's one kind of practical answer in this case. Another practical concern is all of this is based on looking at overlaps between trajectory ensembles. Anyone who's ever done a free energy calculation knows that computing overlaps just of equilibrium ensembles when the number of particles gets large is itself hard. We're now trying to find overlaps between potentially extensive particle numbers and time. So one of the most complicated parts of these calculations is choosing the observation time, because if we make it arbitrarily large, the overlap between those trajectory distributions get arbitrarily small. So these are all kind of conceptual questions we're honestly grappling with kind of right now. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, David, very nice. I know parts of it, but I want to ask you a question from an experimentalist perspective. Say I was one.
You were never an experimentalist.
What do I need to do to my particles based on these interaction maps, and how can I achieve sort of something? I know how to shear a system, but what else would I need to do to the system to make it, to get those maps?
I asked Chad. No. So we have an interaction map. So what
does that mean?
So let me tell you. So the intensity of that color tells you how long the strand of DNA needs to be, because that's how strong the interaction needs to be. Can you translate that though into a yeah, this is easy. That's exactly right. So each one of these needs to be a different sequence, and then the depth is telling you the strand length, right? So the most intense colors are 8 kBt, so these are not very large strands. The shear is actually the harder part. These shear rates are actually quite large. So this has to be done in a microfluidic cell. Yeah.
So just to follow up on Renee's question. So you briefly said that the upper bound of the heat is tight, but I don't think you meant that, right? It can't be tight because there's a lot of wasteful heat that you could have that is not going to contribute to a rate enhancement. Right. So what is actually the right quantity that would provide like a tight energetic upper bound? Is it like the heat along some reaction coordinate, or can you project in some way to obtain that?
Yeah. So we know the bound is tight in two limits. One is a trivial equilibrium limit, where it doesn't matter where I put the heat, it goes, I've given it enough time to figure out how to funnel it into the reaction coordinate. The other is when I use the Doob force, so when I actually drive on the reactive coordinate, which in a complex system then is hard to uncover.
A question as well. Yes. So if I look at this heat map, right, it's basically 6 by 6 particle. But if I want to make something experimentally, do I need then 6 different species, or can I come up with ways to reduce the amount of particles or species I put into my system?
No, you need 6 different kinds of interactions. Six different. Actually, it's even worse than that. It's 6 by 6 divided by 2. What is it? 18. I need 18 different kinds of DNA.
Okay, but then is there a way you can build in some intrinsic symmetry into the system to reduce the number of new particles you make?
When there is symmetry, in fact, maybe I'll show this real quick. When there is symmetry, the algorithm will actually find it. Let's see. Okay, I give up. Okay, yeah. Huh? Yeah, when there is symmetry, the system will find it, and so we don't have to. We don't have to know what symmetries exist ahead of time.
So what you found is basically the minimal.
Yeah, that's right, and that is actually afforded by how we've constructed the cost function. We're trying to find, in a distant sense, the closest distribution to the original distribution, so it will not add in extraneous forces. Cool.
Thank you so much.